He's too important. She's just nobody. The sentence landed like a verdict under the glow of Manhattan lights, and before anyone could question it, a glass tilted, red wine cascading across Ava Brooks' white dress, slow at first, then soaking through fabric like it belonged there, like the moment had been planned, and the rooftop froze for half a second before the reaction split. Some gasped, some laughed under their breath, others lifted their phones, because this was the kind of scene people did not stop. They recorded, and Ava did not move. Not immediately. She stood there with the skyline behind her, the city stretching out in millions of lights while her world narrowed into a single point, the stain spreading across her dress, warm, deliberate, visible to everyone who had already decided what they were seeing, and the man who did it, Richard Hale, did not step back, did not apologize. He adjusted his cuff like he had just corrected something out of place. His voice low but loud enough for the people closest to hear. Next time, make sure you're invited. And that line traveled faster than the wine itself, rippling through the crowd, shaping the narrative before anyone asked a question, because in rooms like this, people did not look for truth, they looked for hierarchy, and Ava, standing there in a dress now marked, in heels that made no sound, in silence that did not defend itself, did not fit what they expected power to look like, and so they filled in the rest. A +1, a mistake, someone who slipped past the door, and security began to move. Not aggressively, not urgently, just confidently, like this was routine, like they had seen this before and knew exactly how it ended, one of them stepping forward with a practiced tone. We're going to need you to come with us, and Ava finally shifted her gaze, not to the guard, not to the crowd, but to the man who had just tried to reduce her to a moment, and she looked at him the way someone looks at a decision that has already been made. Calm, precise, almost detached. And then she looked down at the stain, the deep red against white, spreading without permission, and for a second the noise around her faded, not gone, just distant, because something older than this moment surfaced, something familiar, the memory of rooms where she was measured before she spoke, where her presence required explanation, where someone else decided if she belonged, and she had learned then that reactions gave people what they expected, but silence made them reveal themselves, and so she did not wipe the wine, did not argue, did not raise her voice. She let it sit there, visible, undeniable, and when she finally spoke, it was not loud, not dramatic, just clear enough to cut through the assumptions forming around her. You're going to want to remember this moment, she said, and no one knew exactly why, not yet, but something in the way she said it shifted the air, just slightly, just enough for a few people to stop smiling, to lower their phones, to look again, because the woman standing in front of them was not reacting the way she was supposed to. And in a room built on appearances, that was the first sign that something was about to break. The security guard stopped just short of touching her, something in Ava Brooks' stillness making him hesitate, not out of recognition, not yet, but out of instinct, like stepping into something he did not fully understand, and around them the rooftop began to shift, not loudly, but subtly, conversations lowering into whispers, phones still raised but now steadier, more focused. Because the moment had stopped being entertainment and started becoming something else, something uncertain, and Richard Hale noticed it too, the change in energy, the way a few people were no longer looking at Ava with dismissal but with curiosity, and that unsettled him more than anything, so he stepped forward slightly, reclaiming space with the ease of someone used to being followed. I said remove her, he repeated, louder this time, making sure the room heard it, reinforcing the version of reality he needed them to believe, and the guard nodded. Regaining his script, you need to leave the premises, but Ava did not move, did not step back, did not even look at him, her eyes still fixed on Richard, calm, steady, as if the rest of the room had faded out of relevance, and that calm began to feel out of place, because people in her position were supposed to react, to explain, to defend, and she was doing none of that, and it created a pause no one could quite explain. And then from the edge of the crowd, a voice broke through, quiet but clear. She was on the list, and heads turned, the source revealed as a young woman holding a tablet, one of the event coordinators. Her expression uncertain but firm enough to be heard. I saw her name earlier, she added, glancing between Ava and the check-in station as if trying to reconcile what she knew with what she was seeing, and immediately another voice cut in, sharper, dismissive. Then you saw it wrong, Richard said, not even looking at her, because acknowledging doubt would give it space to grow, and he could not afford that, not here, not in front of this audience, but the doubt had already entered the room, small but present, and Ava sensed it without turning, without shifting, because doubt was the first crack in control, and once it appeared, it did not disappear easily, and she finally reached into her bag, slow enough for everyone to see, deliberate enough to make them watch, pulling out her phone with the same calm precision she had held since the wine touched her dress, and a few people leaned in, not physically, but mentally, attention narrowing. Because something about this did not match the story they had already accepted, and Ava glanced briefly at the screen, then back up, her voice low but carrying just enough to reach the nearest circle. "Pull the investor registry," she said, not to anyone in front of her, but to someone on the other end of the line, and the words themselves did not mean much to most people there, but the tone did, the certainty, the absence of hesitation, the way it sounded less like a request and more like a command already in motion, and the coordinator with the tablet froze, her fingers hovering as if waiting for something to update, while the large LED display behind the bar flickered once, then again, subtle enough to be ignored by those still clinging to the original narrative, but not by the ones paying attention. And Richard noticed it, his eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second before he forced a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "You are making this worse for yourself," he said, quieter now, leaning slightly closer, trying to bring the moment back under his control. But Ava did not respond to the warning, did not acknowledge the threat. She simply stood there, the stain on her dress no longer the center of attention, her silence doing something louder than any argument could. And as the screen behind them began to change, lines of data replacing event visuals, the room collectively held its breath without realizing it, because the story they thought they understood was no longer holding together, and whatever was about to replace it was already unfolding in front of them. The screen behind the bar did not just flicker this time, it shifted completely, the soft ambient visuals of the gala dissolving into a clean, structured interface that did not belong to the event, columns of data aligning with quiet precision, names, percentages, ownership tiers, and for a second no one reacted because they did not understand what they were looking at, but Ava Brooks did not turn around to check. She already knew what was there, and that confidence, that stillness, made the room pay attention in a way it had not before, because something had changed, not in volume, not in movement, but in gravity, and the event coordinator stepped closer to her tablet, eyes widening as the same data mirrored onto her screen, syncing in real time, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is pulling from the main registry," and that was when the first real shift happened, because the main registry was not part of the event. It was part of the company behind it, and Richard Hale heard it, even if he pretended not to, his posture tightening just enough to betray the crack forming beneath his confidence, and he glanced toward the screen, just briefly, just long enough to confirm what he did not want to see, and then looked away again as if ignoring it would make it irrelevant. But the crowd had already turned, not physically, but mentally, their attention no longer on the stain, no longer on the assumption, but on the information now unfolding in front of them, and Ava finally shifted her gaze, not to the people, but to the display, her eyes moving once, calm, confirming, and then she spoke, not loudly, not for effect, just enough to anchor the moment. "Scroll," she said, and the system responded instantly, the list moving, positions updating, percentages aligning until one name rose to the top, not highlighted, not exaggerated, just present in a way that made everything else fall into place around it. Ava Brooks, 51% controlling interest, and the silence that followed was no longer confusion, it was recognition, the kind that arrives all at once and leaves no room for denial, and the coordinator lowered her tablet slightly, her expression shifting from uncertainty to something closer to shock, while the security guard stepped back without being told, his role dissolving as quickly as it had formed. And Richard finally looked again, this time unable to look away. His eyes locking onto the number, the name, the structure he thought he understood now rearranged in a way that placed him exactly where he had never expected to be, beneath, and Ava did not move toward him, did not step forward or raise her voice, she simply stood there, letting the truth exist without decoration, without explanation, because it did not need either, and when she spoke again her tone had not changed, but the room heard it differently now. "You built your authority on visibility," she said, her gaze steady, "but ownership does not need an audience," and that sentence settled deeper than anything before it, because it reframed everything they had just witnessed, the wine, the laughter, the assumptions, all of it now exposed as surface level, temporary, irrelevant in the face of what actually held power in that space, and one of the guests slowly lowered their phone, as if realizing they were no longer recording a spectacle, but a shift, and the skyline behind them remained unchanged, millions of lights stretching into the distance, but on that rooftop, in that moment, the balance had already moved, and there was no going back to what they thought this was. No one laughed now, not even quietly, because the number on that screen had done what no explanation ever could. It had redrawn the entire room in a single line of data, and Ava Brooks stood exactly where she had been when the wine first hit her dress, but everything around her had shifted, the assumptions, the hierarchy, the invisible lines people followed without thinking, all of it now exposed and rearranged. And Richard Hale felt it before he could respond to it, the subtle withdrawal of attention. The way eyes that had followed him now moved past him, toward her, and for a moment he said nothing, his confidence no longer automatic, no longer unquestioned, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, controlled, but missing the certainty it carried before. "This does not change the structure of the board," he said, attempting to reclaim ground that had already disappeared, and Ava turned her head slightly, not surprised, not offended, just acknowledging the effort, because she had seen this part before too, the moment where someone tried to hold onto authority after it had already shifted, and she answered without raising her voice. "It defines it," and that sentence landed clean, precise, leaving no room to reinterpret what had already been proven, and one of the investors near the back straightened, his posture adjusting as if he had just realized which direction power was flowing, while another quietly stepped aside, creating space without being asked, and Ava took a single step forward, not toward Richard, but toward the center of the room, grounding herself in a position that did not need to be announced because it was already recognized, and behind her the screen remained unchanged, her name still at the top, her ownership still visible, not fading, not cycling, just constant, and that constancy mattered more than anything she could say, and she let a brief silence settle before continuing. "You assumed presence equals permission," she said, her gaze moving across the crowd, not accusing, but revealing, and absence equals weakness, a pause, just enough for the meaning to register. "That assumption is what put you here," and this time no one interrupted. No one laughed, because the room had already learned the cost of getting that assumption wrong, and Richard shifted slightly, his hand brushing against the edge of the table behind him as if anchoring himself to something solid, something familiar, but even that did not hold the way it used to, and Ava's voice remained steady, unwavering. "You did not spill wine on a guest," she continued, her eyes returning to him, locking in place with quiet certainty. "You did it to the person who controls the room you are standing in," and that was the moment the last layer of denial fell away, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because there was no version of reality left where this could be minimized or redirected, and the rooftop, once filled with noise and movement, now held something else entirely, a stillness shaped by recognition, by consequence, by the understanding that what had started as a moment of humiliation had already turned into something far more permanent, and Ava did not need to raise her voice or repeat herself, because the truth had already settled into every corner of the space, and it was not going anywhere. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted, slowly, like a room recalibrating around a truth it could no longer ignore, and Ava Brooks stood at the center of it, unchanged, unshaken, while everything else adjusted in response to her, and one by one, the small movements began, a glass lowered, a phone tilted downward, a step taken back, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because the line between observer and participant had just disappeared, and no one wanted to be standing on the wrong side of it, and Richard Hale felt that shift more than anyone, not because he could see it, but because he was no longer the one controlling it, and that loss, quiet as it was, pressed against him in a way he could not deflect, and he tried again, one last attempt to stabilize what had already slipped. "This is being taken out of context," he said, his voice measured, reaching for authority that was no longer there, but Ava did not interrupt, did not challenge the statement directly. She simply let it exist for a second before answering with something far more final. "Context is what you reveal when you think it does not matter," and the sentence settled into the room with a weight that no one could dismiss, because it reframed everything they had just witnessed, not as an isolated moment, but as a reflection of something deeper, something intentional, and Ava took another step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just present in a way that made avoidance impossible, and she reached for her phone again, tapping once. Deliberate, controlled, and the system responded immediately, the display behind her shifting again, not to ownership this time, but to contracts, agreements, partnerships, a web of connections that extended beyond the rooftop, beyond the event, into the structure that supported it all, and names began to appear, organizations, affiliations, each one linked, each one traceable, And the room grew quieter with each line that populated the screen, because this was no longer about a single interaction, it was about an entire network now visible in real time, and Ava spoke without raising her voice. Every partnership connected to this event is tied to this structure, she said, her tone steady, each word clear, and every action taken here reflects on that structure. A brief pause, just long enough for the implication to settle, including yours, and Richard's gaze flickered again, not with confidence this time, but with calculation, because he understood what she was doing. Not reacting, not defending, but expanding the moment into something far larger than he could control. And one of the investors shifted, glancing at the screen, then at Richard, then back again, as if reassessing a position that had just become unstable. And Ava continued, calm, precise. You represent more than yourself in this space, she said, her eyes steady, and tonight, you made that representation very clear. And that was when the realization fully settled across the room, not just that she held power, but that she could redefine the consequences of what had just happened, not through emotion, not through confrontation, but through structure, through systems that did not rely on opinion. And Ava let the silence return once more, not as pressure, but as certainty, because the moment had already shifted beyond reaction, beyond explanation, into something final, something that would not be undone by words. And as the city lights continued to glow behind them, unchanged, distant, the people on that rooftop understood something they had not before. That power was not loud, it was not performative, it was quiet, precise. And when it moved, it did not ask for attention, it took control of everything around it. The screen did not stop updating, it expanded, line after line of contracts, affiliations, and financial ties unfolding with a precision that felt almost surgical. And Ava Brooks stood in front of it like she had already seen the outcome, like this was not escalation but confirmation, and the people around her felt it, the shift from spectacle to consequence, from something that could be laughed off to something that could not be contained. And Richard Hale's expression tightened further as he watched the names appear, organizations he was connected to, boards he sat on, investments he relied on, all now visible within a system he no longer controlled. And he stepped forward slightly, lowering his voice as if proximity could reduce the impact. You are overreacting, he said, but the words did not carry, they did not land the way they once would have, because the room had already moved past opinion. It was now operating on evidence, and Ava did not respond immediately. She let the screen continue for another second, another two, until the full scope of the network was undeniable, and then she spoke, calm, precise, her voice cutting through the quiet without needing to rise. No, she said, a single word, steady, I am documenting. And that distinction shifted everything again, because reaction could be debated, emotion could be dismissed, but documentation meant permanence, it meant record, it meant consequence that extended beyond this moment. And one of the investors near the back took a slow step away from Richard, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it happened, and then another followed, and the space around him began to widen, not dramatically, but enough to be felt, enough to signal that alignment was changing. And Ava's eyes moved across the screen once more before returning to the room. Every agreement tied to this event runs through this structure, she said, her tone unwavering, and every participant is accountable to it. A brief pause, her gaze steady, including you, and this time no one tried to interrupt, no one tried to soften the statement, because the system behind her had already validated it. And Richard's posture shifted again, not with authority, but with awareness, the realization settling in that this was no longer about controlling the narrative, it was about surviving the outcome. And Ava took a single step forward, closing the distance just enough to make the moment personal without ever raising her voice. You acted publicly, she continued, her words measured, deliberate, so the response will be just as visible. And that sentence landed with quiet finality, because it made one thing clear. This would not disappear, it would not be handled privately, it would not be softened behind closed doors, and the people around them understood that too, their attention fixed, their silence no longer passive but engaged, witnessing something that had already crossed the point of reversal. And Ava reached for her phone once more, tapping again with the same calm precision, and the system responded instantly, a new layer appearing over the network. Status indicators shifting, access points recalibrating, subtle changes that meant everything to those who understood them, and the room held its breath without realizing it, because the structure was no longer just being revealed, it was being rewritten in real time. And Ava stood there, composed, controlled, not rushing the moment, because she knew exactly what came next, and more importantly, so did they. The room did not erupt, it compressed, like everything inside it had been pulled tighter around a single point, and that point was no longer the stain on Ava Brooks' dress or the man who caused it, it was the system unfolding behind her, shifting in real time, recalibrating authority with quiet precision, and as the status indicators updated. Small icons turning from active to restricted, access flags changing color one by one, the people who understood what they were seeing felt it immediately, the kind of shift that did not need explanation because it carried consequence built into its design, and Richard Hale saw it too, even if he did not fully grasp the scope yet, his eyes moving quickly across the screen, searching for something stable, something unchanged, but finding less and less of it with each passing second, and he took a step forward again. This time not to command the room but to reach for control he could feel slipping. "You cannot do this here," he said, his voice lower now, edged with something closer to urgency than authority, but Ava did not respond to the objection, because it was already outdated, already irrelevant in a moment that had moved beyond permission, and instead she let the system finish its update. "Let the final status settle into place before speaking, it is already done," she said, calm. Measured, not as a threat, not as a declaration, just as fact, and that word fact seemed to echo through the silence, because it removed any illusion that this could still be negotiated, and one of the executives near the edge of the crowd glanced down at his phone, then back up at the screen, his expression shifting as if confirming something privately, and then he stepped back, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough to signal distance, and that movement did not go unnoticed. Others followed in smaller ways, adjusting position, redirecting attention, quietly realigning themselves with what was now clearly the center of power, and Ava watched none of it directly. She did not need to, she understood the pattern, the way alignment changed when certainty entered the room, and she finally turned her gaze back to Richard, not confrontational, not emotional, just clear. "You assumed this was a moment," she said, her voice steady, "something that could pass. Something that could be explained away." A brief pause, her eyes unwavering, "But this is a record," and that distinction settled deeper than anything before it, because moments fade, but records remain, and Richard's posture shifted again, the weight of that realization pressing in, his voice quieter now, almost measured. "We can resolve this privately," he said, but the room already knew the answer before Ava spoke, because everything about her presence had made it clear what kind of response this would be, and she answered exactly as expected, without raising her voice, without hesitation. "You made it public," she said, each word precise. "So it stays public," and that was the point where the last possibility of containment disappeared, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, and the rooftop, once filled with movement and conversation, now held something else entirely, a stillness shaped by consequence, by the understanding that what had happened could not be undone, only followed through, and Ava reached for her phone one more time, not urgently, not reactively, just continuing a process already in motion. And as she tapped the screen, the system responded again, locking in the changes, finalizing what had already been set, and she did not look back at it, did not need to confirm, because she trusted the structure she had built, the one they had just tried to challenge, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. "This is where it ends for you," she said, not harsh, not raised, just absolute. And the room understood that she was not describing a moment, she was defining an outcome. The words did not echo, they settled, firm and unmoving, and for a moment no one in the room seemed willing to breathe too loudly, as if even the smallest sound might disrupt the finality that had just been spoken, and Ava Brooks remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, while everything around her continued to adjust, recalibrate, realign, and Richard Hale stood facing her, but not with the same presence he had carried minutes ago. Something in him had shifted. Not visibly dramatic, but undeniable, like a structure losing its foundation one quiet crack at a time, and he opened his mouth to respond, then stopped, because whatever he was about to say no longer fit the moment. No longer matched the reality now displayed on every screen, and the people around them felt it too, the way conversation had disappeared, replaced by observation, by calculation, by the quiet instinct to step away from something collapsing in real time, and Ava did not press forward, did not demand acknowledgement, she simply let the space exist as it was, because this was not about forcing recognition. It was about allowing it to happen fully, completely, without interference, and after a few seconds she turned slightly, not away from him, but toward the screen behind her, where the final status indicators had settled into place, access revoked, contracts flagged, affiliations under review. All of it precise, all of it irreversible in the moment it was executed, and she spoke again, her voice steady, carrying just enough to reach everyone without needing to rise. "Every system remembers," she said, her eyes moving across the display, even when people choose not to, and that line carried something deeper than the data itself, because it pointed to the truth beneath all of it, that what had happened here was not new, not isolated, just exposed in a way that could no longer be hidden. And one of the guests near the edge of the rooftop lowered his phone completely, slipping it into his pocket as if recognizing that this was no longer something to capture, it was something to understand. And another guest quietly stepped away from Richard's side, creating distance without explanation, because alignment had already shifted, and Ava turned her attention back to the room, her gaze steady, composed, not searching for reactions, not measuring responses, just present in a way that made everything else secondary. And when she spoke again, her tone remained calm, but the weight behind it had deepened. "You built your position on perception," she said, her eyes resting briefly on Richard before moving on. "On who people believed you were in rooms like this." A pause. Just enough for the meaning to settle, but perception does not survive truth, and that sentence did not need emphasis, did not need repetition, because the room itself had already proven it, and the skyline behind them continued to stretch endlessly into the night, unchanged, distant, but on that rooftop, in that moment, something permanent had already taken place, something that would extend far beyond the event, beyond the conversation, into every system that now held a record of what had happened. And Ava stood there, not as someone who had reacted, not as someone who had defended herself, but as someone who had revealed the structure beneath everything, and in doing so, had left no space for anything else to stand. The rooftop did not return to normal, it could not, because something fundamental had already shifted, something deeper than embarrassment or authority, and Ava Brooks stood in that stillness like it belonged to her, not because she demanded it, but because she understood it, the way moments like this did not end, they extended, they echoed through decisions, through systems, through every quiet conversation that would follow long after the lights dimmed, and around her the guests began to move. Again, but differently now, not drifting aimlessly, not performing status, but recalculating, reassessing where they stood in relation to what had just been revealed, and a few of them stepped forward, not close enough to interrupt, but close enough to be seen, their posture no longer aligned with Richard Hale, but with her, subtle shifts that spoke louder than any statement, and Richard remained where he was, but the space around him had changed, widened, thinned, as if the room itself had stepped back from him without needing to be told, and he finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before, controlled but carrying something new, something closer to realization than resistance. "This does not have to go further," he said, and for a moment it sounded almost reasonable, almost like a path back to balance, but Ava did not move toward that path, she did not even consider it, because she understood what he was asking. Not resolution, but containment, and she answered with the same calm precision she had carried from the beginning. "It already has," she said, and that sentence closed the distance between action and consequence completely, leaving no room for delay, no space for negotiation, and the system behind her reflected it, new notifications appearing along the edge of the display, confirmations, acknowledgements, external systems receiving the updates, the record extending beyond the rooftop, beyond the event, into networks that did not forget, did not reinterpret, did not soften what had been documented, and one of the investors glanced down at his phone again. This time longer, reading something that had just arrived, his expression tightening before he looked back up, not at Richard, but at Ava, as if understanding now that the moment had already moved beyond the room they were standing in, and Ava turned slightly, her gaze moving across the skyline for just a second, the city stretching out beneath them, constant, indifferent, and then she returned her attention to the room, her voice steady, grounded. "You thought this was about presence," she said, her eyes settling back on Richard. "About who is seen and who is not." A brief pause, just enough for the weight of it to land, but it was always about control, and that word control settled deeper than anything before it, because it named the truth behind every action that had led to this point, and Ava did not raise her voice, did not repeat herself, she simply let it exist, because the room no longer needed convincing, it needed understanding. And as the final confirmations continued to appear on the screen behind her, one after another, quiet, precise, irreversible, it became clear to everyone present that this was no longer a moment they were witnessing, it was a shift they were part of, and Ava Brooks stood at the center of it, not reacting, not defending, but defining exactly how it would end. The confirmations did not stop, they layered, each one reinforcing the last, each one pushing the moment further beyond anything that could be undone, and Ava Brooks stood in the center of it all with the same calm presence she had carried from the beginning, not elevated by the outcome, not softened by it, just steady, like this was not a victory but a correction, and around her the rooftop no longer felt like a place for celebration. It felt like a place where something had been exposed too clearly to ignore, and the people who once filled the space with noise now moved with intention, some stepping away entirely, others repositioning themselves closer to her orbit, as if proximity now mattered in a different way, not socially, but structurally, and Richard Hale remained where he was, but the distance between him and everyone else had become undeniable, not measured in steps, but in alignment, and he finally lowered his gaze for a brief second, not in defeat, but in recognition, the kind that comes when a reality can no longer be reshaped, and when he looked back up, there was no argument left in his expression, only the quiet awareness of consequence settling in, and Ava watched him for a moment, not with satisfaction, not with judgment, but with clarity, because this was never about him alone, it was about what his actions represented. And when she spoke again her voice carried that understanding, this was never just about one action. She said, her tone even, her words deliberate, it was about what you believed you could do without consequence, a pause, just long enough for the meaning to take hold, and who you believed it would not affect, and that sentence reached beyond him, beyond the immediate moment, touching everyone who had watched, who had stayed silent, who had assumed the same outcome would always apply, and Ava let her gaze move across the room once more, not accusing, not isolating, just acknowledging the shared space where all of this had happened. That assumption ends here, she said, and there was no force in her voice, no raised tone, just certainty, the kind that did not need to be reinforced because it had already been demonstrated, and the system behind her reflected it again, a final set of confirmations appearing, access fully revoked, affiliation severed, status updated across every connected network. And the quiet notification tone that followed felt almost ceremonial, not loud, not dramatic, but definitive, and one of the guests exhaled slowly, as if releasing something they had not realized they were holding, while another turned away entirely, walking toward the edge of the rooftop, where the city lights stretched endlessly below, seeking distance from a moment that had become too real to stand inside comfortably, and Ava remained where she was, not moving to leave, not lingering either, simply present until the process reached its natural conclusion, and when she finally picked up her phone again, the screen now still, the system quiet, she did not check it, did not need to confirm anything further, because everything that needed to be done had already been set in motion. And when she spoke one last time into the silence, her voice carried no edge, no emphasis, just truth. Respect is not granted by position, she said, her eyes steady, it is revealed by action, and the words did not echo, they settled, final, unchallenged, and as the skyline continued to glow behind them, unchanged and distant, the people on that rooftop understood something they would not forget. That power does not announce itself when it is present, it reveals itself when it is tested, and tonight, it had been tested completely. No one applauded, no one spoke up to fill the silence, because what had just happened did not invite reaction, it demanded reflection, and Ava Brooks stood there for a moment longer, not to extend the moment, but to let it settle fully, completely, into the space it had reshaped, and around her the rooftop began to move again, but not in the way it had before, not with careless laughter or effortless confidence, but with quiet intention, people stepping aside, creating space not out of obligation but recognition, because the center of gravity had already shifted and they could feel it, and Richard Hale remained still, not frozen, but grounded in a reality he had not anticipated, his posture no longer projecting authority but absorbing consequence, and for the first time since the moment began, he did not try to speak, did not attempt to redirect, because there was nothing left to redirect. Only the outcome he now had to face, and Ava looked at him briefly, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with clarity, as if acknowledging that the moment had reached its natural end, and then she turned slightly, not away from him, but toward the room as a whole, her presence still steady, still composed, and when she spoke again her voice carried something quieter, but deeper, something that reached beyond the immediate moment into something more lasting. What you do when you think no one is watching, she said, her gaze moving across the people gathered around her, that is who you are, and the sentence did not need emphasis, it did not need repetition, because the room itself had just witnessed its truth unfold in real time, and Few guests lowered their eyes, not out of shame, but out of recognition, while others simply stood still, absorbing what they had seen, what they had been part of, and Ava let that moment breathe, not controlling it, not directing it, just allowing it to exist, because this was not about winning, it was about revealing, and once something is revealed, it cannot be unseen, and she took a small step forward, her heels quiet against the floor, her movement unhurried, deliberate, as she began to walk past the space where everything had just unfolded, not leaving in a rush, not lingering for attention, just moving forward with the same calm certainty she had carried from the start, and as she passed, the people closest to her shifted instinctively, making room without being asked, their bodies responding to something they now understood without needing explanation, and the skyline remained behind them, constant and distant. But on that rooftop something had been redefined, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, and as Ava moved toward the exit, her presence no longer questioned, no longer misunderstood, the room behind her remained quiet, not because it had nothing to say, but because it had finally understood what it had been shown, and that understanding did not need words, it carried itself, steady and permanent, into whatever came next. The door did not close behind Ava Brooks with force, it settled softly, almost unnoticed, but the effect it left behind carried far more weight than any sound could, and the rooftop remained suspended in that quiet aftermath, a space that had been transformed without spectacle, without chaos, just through clarity that could not be reversed, and the people who remained stood in place for a moment longer, not because they did not know what to do next, but because they understood that whatever they did next would now carry the imprint of what they had just witnessed, and Richard Hale remained where he had been, but the room no longer recognized him the same way, not as a figure of influence, not as a center of attention, but as someone who had crossed a line that could not be stepped back over, and he looked around, not searching for support, but measuring absence, the subtle but undeniable shift in how others responded to him, or did not respond at all, and across the space, conversations began again, but in lower tones, more deliberate, not casual, not dismissive, because the moment had recalibrated the boundaries of what was acceptable, what was visible, and what would carry consequence. And one of the investors who had stepped back earlier now moved toward the coordinator, speaking quietly, asking questions not about the event, but about the systems behind it, about the structure that had just been revealed so clearly, and that question, quiet as it was, signaled something larger, that attention had shifted from surface to foundation, from appearance to control, and the large screen that had once displayed the registry now returned to the event visuals, but it felt different, as if everyone in the room now understood what it was capable of showing, what it could reveal when accessed the right way, and that knowledge lingered, unspoken but present, and Richard finally moved, not with the same certainty he had before, but with a measured pace, as if recalculating every step, every word that might follow, and he reached for his phone, glancing down at it, reading something that had already begun to ripple outward, notifications, messages, confirmations that what had happened here had not stayed here, that it had already entered the networks Ava had activated, and his expression tightened, not dramatically, but enough to show that the realization had fully settled in, and across the room, a few guests exchanged looks, not out of gossip, but out of shared understanding, that this was not a moment they would forget, not because of the wine, not because of the confrontation, but because of what it revealed about power, about assumption, about consequence, and outside, the city continued as it always did, cars moving, lights shifting, lives continuing without interruption, but inside that rooftop space, something had been reset, not loudly, not visibly to the outside world, but completely for those who had been present, and though Ava Brooks was no longer in the room, her presence remained in the structure she had activated, in the systems now holding record, in the silence that followed her departure, and in the understanding that what had happened here was not an isolated event, it was a line drawn, clear and irreversible, between what people assumed they could do and what they now knew they could not. 3 months later, the rooftop still stood above Manhattan, the skyline unchanged, the lights just as endless, but everything inside that space had shifted in ways that could not be undone, and Ava Brooks did not return there for recognition. She did not need to, because what she set in motion that night had already moved far beyond a single event, spreading quietly through boardrooms, contracts, and conversations that now carried a different tone, a different awareness, and across the network she controlled, policies were no longer just written, they were enforced with clarity that left no room for interpretation. every partnership re-evaluated, every affiliation reviewed, every structure tested against the standard she had demonstrated without raising her voice once, and those who had witnessed that night carried it with them, not as a story to repeat, but as a moment that changed how they saw power itself. Because it was no longer about who entered the room with confidence, but who held the structure behind it, and Richard Hale's name, once spoken with certainty in those same circles, now appeared differently, not erased, but redefined, attached to a moment that followed him into every new conversation, every new negotiation, a quiet reminder that perception could collapse in seconds when truth stepped in, and inside new meetings, in new rooms. People paused more often, questioned more carefully, because they understood now that the systems behind them were not passive, they were active, responsive, capable of revealing more than anyone intended if tested the wrong way, and Ava continued forward as she always had, not louder, not more visible, just more precise, her presence no longer something to be questioned, but something understood, and when she spoke in those rooms, she did not reference what happened, she did not need to. Because the impact had already been absorbed into the structure itself, into the way people listened, the way they responded, the way they measured their own actions before taking them, and one afternoon, standing in front of a new group of executives, she paused for a moment, looking across the room the same way she had that night, calm, steady, and she said only one sentence, not as a warning, not as a lesson, but as a truth she had already proven: power does not need to prove itself, and the room stayed quiet, not out of uncertainty, but out of understanding, because they had seen what happened when it was tested, and far above the city, where light still stretched endlessly into the distance, the lesson remained, not written, not announced, but carried in every system, every decision, every silence that followed, that respect was never about appearance, never about assumption, it was about structure, and once that structure spoke, nothing else could stand against it.